Do you want to hear how Bob Lawless ended up? My friend Bob Lawless? Well, let me tell you all about it. We stopped being friends in junior high because he started doing drugs. And by senior high, he was selling drugs. And then after high school, I heard the rumor that he had become a pimp and he was selling prostitutes. And you know what he's doing today? He's selling real estate. That's what he's doing. It's a slippery slope, my friends. You never know where this thing's going to go.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
Live long and prosper, my friends. Well, my Father's Day message this year is entitled Men Are From Mars. And all you men, all you fathers anyway, are going to receive Mars bars on your way out. And I'm dressed like Captain James T. Kirk of the USS Enterprise. My mission, to boldly go where no man has gone before. I love the way he talks. Or at least that's my interpretation of it. Actually, I'm not drawing inspiration from Star Trek today, but from John Gray's book, Men Are From Mars, Women From Venus. How many remember that book? It's written a long way back in 1992. His basic concept was that there was a metaphor that the men were from Mars, the women were from Venus. The men fell in love with the Venetian women, and they got married, and then they had to live together and learn how to do that because they were from different planets. Only sold 50 million copies of it, and of course made him a huge success and a huge star. Now, I've never really believed it because when I was in grade 1, the girls used to say to me, boys go to Jupiter to get more stupider. To which I would respond, I think you're mistaken because that's grammatically incorrect. And anyway, so John Gray goes, he writes this book, sells 50 million copies. Every book he ever wrote ever since has the words Mars and Venus in it. Look at the screen there. I mean, if you got a good thing, you kind of just roll with it, right? And, you know, here's the thing. Some of you are going, all right, you've lost me already. Men aren't from Mars. Well, I'm going to prove it to you from Scripture. Acts chapter 17, verse 22. Check it out. This is what it says. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. So first of all, where was he? He was on Mars, on the hill, and who was he talking to? Only men. Why? Because the women were all on Venus. So I've proved it biblically already, but I can prove it anecdotally as well. Let me just ask you a question. How many of you in this room are married women? How many married women in the room? How many do we have? How many think that sometimes your husband seems like he's from another planet? All the same hands going on. Prove my point. So today I'm not going to talk about the differences between men and women. I think we all mostly realize that. What I'm going to talk about when I'm saying men are from Mars, I'm going to talk about this. That as Christians and as Christian men, you actually need to live like you are from another planet. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, but I want you to think about this for a moment because our example, our best example is Jesus, and he said this, finish it for me. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. And when Jesus came into this world, he didn't live like he was from this world. He lived like he was from another planet. And he didn't fit in with anybody. He didn't fit in with the Galileans, where he was from. He didn't fit in with the Romans who had conquered. He didn't fit in with the religious Jews. What Jesus did was he stood apart from the crowd. Would you agree with that? He didn't try to fit in. He didn't try to be like everybody else. In fact, let me go a little further. I think what he did was he stood above the crowd is what he did. And let me tell you something, in case you've forgotten this. He told you to do the same thing. It's in John chapter 17. He says, you are not of this world, just as I am not of this world. His commission to us is that we might be in the world, but we are not to live as the world. And my challenge to you as men is that if you are men from Mars, then your children should be children from Mars and grow up to be men and women of Mars. Now, I'm not saying Mars, of course. You know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that we are to live differently. We shouldn't be ashamed to live above the fray of this world and not worry about always having to fit in and not worry about our kids having to conform to this world. Do not be conformed to this world, Paul said, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So I'm going to give you this fantastic biblical example today. It's a little known story about a tribe called the Rechabites. Now, the Rechabites were actually a Gentile tribe, and they were related to Moses through marriage. And what happened was, because they were related to Moses, they actually converted to Judaism. And when the children of Israel came into the Promised Land, the Rechabites, this converted Gentile tribe to Judaism, came in with them. And so we don't know too much about them, except we know that the patriarch of the family was a man named Jonadab. And Jonadab, it says, had great zeal for the Lord. And the biggest reference to them is actually in 2 Kings chapter 10. And we have the story, some of you will remember, where King Ahab and Jezebel had been deposed by King Jehu. And Jezebel had brought all of this Baal worship into Israel. And once she was gone and dead, and Jehu was the king, what the scripture says was that Jonadab came and partnered with King Jehu to tear down the idol worship and to destroy Baal worship and eliminate it from Israel, because he was this incredible godly man. So he came and did that. They tore down the high places together. And then that's the last reference we hear of the Rechabites or of Jonadab for 240 years. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we see the Rechabites again. Here's the story. Jeremiah is the prophet in Jerusalem, and he's got bad news for everybody. The bad news is that they have been disobedient, and God's going to judge Israel, and he's gathering people and telling them this news. And one of the groups that he invites is the Rechabites. So he invites the Rechabites to come, brings them to the temple. I mean, no joke. He invited them over for drinks. Wait till we get into the story. He invites them over to the temple, sits them down at a table, and sets out glasses of wine for them. And that's where we're going to pick up this incredible story that you're going to learn a lot about fatherhood in. So here we are. We're in Jeremiah chapter 35, and we're going to start at verse 5. Remember, this is Jeremiah talking. He says, "Then I set before the sons of the house of the Rechabites bowls full of wine and cups, and I said to them, 'Drink wine.' But they said, 'We will drink no wine. For Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, saying, You shall drink no wine, nor your sons forever. You shall not build a house, sow seed, plant a vineyard, nor have any of these things. But all your days you shall dwell in tents, that you may live many days in the land where you are sojourners.'" I mean, this is an incredible story. These guys, these Rechabites, had been living for 240 years since Jonadab and doing two things. One, they were not drinking wine, and the other thing was they were still living in tents. Everybody else had settled into the Promised Land. They were building cities, and they were building houses, and they were establishing farms. But Jonadab said, "Don't do it," and so they didn't do it. And 240 years, think about that. That's 10, 12 generations later. These dudes are still not farming, they're still not planting crops, they still don't have vineyards, and they're still living in tents. Now let me ask you a question. How many of you have ever been on a tour of Israel? Anybody in the room? There's always a few. A few people, hands up here. And if you go to the Negev Desert, one of the places that you travel through, one of the interesting sights is you see the Bedouin tribes. And here's a picture of them. They're just off in the desert in the middle of nowhere. And this is what the anthropologists are now telling us, is that many of these tribes claim, catch this, to be direct descendants of the Rechabites. 2,700 years later, and they're still living in tents. Here's my favorite picture. Catch this one. That looks suspiciously like a satellite dish outside of that tent. This dude might be living in a tent, but he's got 65 inches of plasma on the other side of that canvas, right? And so here's this amazing story about these guys that said, this is what our forefather, Jonadab, taught us, and we're going to stick to it. And you put this wine in front of us, and we're not going to drink it because he told us not to 240 years ago. So then Jeremiah's got some good news for him and some bad news. And he said, the bad news is this, is that God is going to judge Israel, and he's going to destroy Israel. But here's the good news. You and you alone will be spared because you have obeyed your father Jonadab and you have kept and lived by his precepts. This is an amazing story. Somebody's cheering over there because they're getting it. This is an amazing story of fatherhood. Now, I want to just give you a little caveat. I am not talking about you going and moving in tents, all right? Don't misunderstand that at all. What I'm trying for you to see is the incredible power of fatherhood that we would see in this story of the Rechabites, and there's something we can learn from it. So because my message is entitled, Men Are From Mars, I'm going to use Mars as my acrostic, and I'm going to use them for my 4 points. And here they are, Men Are From Mars. Here's my 4 points. Mentorship, affirmation, role model, and sacrifice. Remember this, I'm not going through all 4 of these things at length, but I'm going to plow a couple of them because we need to figure it out. And the first one is this. The first one is mentorship. Now, how many of you think in order to get people to live in tents for 240 years or 2,700 years, you're probably mentoring them in your way of life? Do you think that's a fair conclusion? And it's absolutely true. And that's what ancient cultures have always done. The fathers always mentored the sons in whatever it was, whatever their culture. You find that in North American natives. You find that in tribal peoples all over the world. And that was just true. The father would mentor the son. And so what we're looking at today is the fact that we have to reclaim this thing called mentorship, this thing called apprenticeship. Fathers need to begin to look at their children and say, what can I do to influence them? What can I do to take the values and the things that I have learned along the way and somehow impart them to my children? That's what we're talking about. Now, don't think for a minute that it cannot be done, because it can. Let me ask you this question. I'll give you this illustration. Anybody watch on television, anybody watch Major League Baseball? Yeah, not too many. I know it's like watching grass grow. I get it. I don't watch it either. I'm kidding. Actually, I'm not. Super boring. But if you're a baseball fan, here's one name that you'll know, and that's Ken Griffey. How many of you know that name, Ken Griffey? Even non-baseball fans know this, because the Griffey family is a legacy in the baseball world. So here's the story. Ken Griffey, he becomes a baseball player, and he becomes one of the great baseball players, played for 4 different teams. He was a 3-time All-Star. He won 2 World Series, great baseball player. But besides his passion for baseball, his greatest passion was for his family and for his children. And if you go read his story, it's amazing how much he loved and how much time he spent with his kids, even though he's on the road all the time. That was what his passion truly was. His son has the same love for baseball, and his son, too, plays in a major league basis. And catch this, in 1990, the father and son played together on the Seattle Mariners. An incredible story where a father, this almost never happens in any sport, but occasionally it does happen. Here's a father who mentored his son, and of course his son's name is Ken Griffey Jr. So this is junior and senior. He was often called Junior. And here's what was amazing about Ken Griffey Jr. Well, that particular day, it was their very first game. They went out and they hit home runs back-to-back, father and son. I mean, this story just gets better and better and better. And then, of course, Ken Griffey Jr., he excels his father. He was an All-Star 13 times. He was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 2016. And he is up there. He's the top 6 home runs of all time. He's right up there with Barry Bonds and Hank Aaron and the rest of them, one of the greatest hitters of all time. But you know what? That's not the end of the story. Because in 1999, Ken Griffey Jr. was getting an amazing award. He was being awarded Player of the Decade. That means the whole 1990s, I mean, you think of all the great players in the 90s, he was going to be and was being awarded Player of the Decade. But he had a conflict because the ceremony, the award ceremony, was on the same night as his 5-year-old son Trey's first baseball game. And he chose to go to the baseball game instead of the award ceremony. Have you people seen 5-year-old baseball? That is seriously the worst game going. It's not even baseball, it's t-ball. They stick that ball up on that post and they swing and they miss and they swing and they miss. And he could have been awarded this great award. Well, he did get it, but he got it in absence. And yet he chose to go to 5-year-old Trey's first baseball game. What does that tell you? That tells you that here was a man who understood the importance of fatherhood. You know what the great tragedy of this story is that Trey turned out didn't really like baseball, didn't become a baseball player. And instead he went into football and was drafted to the Indianapolis Colts. Here he is just this spring. An amazing story. This is a great family because they understood the power of family and the power of fatherhood and the power of mentorship. So the first thing is mentorship. The second thing is affirmation. Now, I'm not going to say much about this. I've talked lots about this because I don't think we really see it in the story of the Rechabites. But let me say this. Every child, young or old, requires the affirmation of their father. There is something intuitive, something innate within each one of us that we need our father to speak those words of affirmation. And it doesn't matter how old they are, they always need it. When I was 24 years old, I proposed to Kathy, and I was getting married, obviously, and the very, very, very first phone call I made, I phoned my dad. And I said, "Hey, Dad, I got some news for you. I'm getting married." To which my dad said, "Oh, well, why should you be happy?" True story. True story. Now, you need to understand, my dad was a smart aleck, just like his son, and the apple don't fall too far from the tree, and he has mentored me in the fine art of sarcasm, so I owe a lot to my father. So the M stands for mentorship, the A stands for affirmation, and the R stands for role model. Now, how many of you think that the Rechabites had to kind of model what they were trying to get their sons to do? I mean, they were living in tents because they wanted their sons and daughters to live in tents. And so you just have to live that thing out. And here's what you need to understand about being the role model as the father. I don't know how to explain this except to say it's true. You know, a child may listen to his mother, but he will imitate his father. How many of you know that's true? It doesn't matter what you say. See, that person's really digging it over there. It doesn't matter what you say as a father, it's what you do. And here's the worst part of this story. Maybe it's the best, but maybe it's the worst. Whatever you do, man, your kids will imitate, and they will multiply it. Whatever you do, they will do in spades. But here's the thing. The role model is so important. Let me out my kids a little bit here. I've got 3 kids. They've all grown and left the house now. But here's the thing that drove Kathy crazy, was all 3 of our kids threw their clothes on the floor. They all did it. Didn't matter whether they were clean, dirty, boom. They were on the floor. The whole bedrooms were covered in clothes. And here's what we never understood. Kathy doesn't throw her clothes on the floor. It's a huge mystery for us. I mean, she's neat and tidy. Why are the kids just throwing their clothes on the floor? I know, it's a mystery. It's crazy. We never figured it out. No. But my youngest daughter was the worst of them all. I mean, her room looked like a cyclone went through it. I mean, she had every drawer was open a little bit further than the one above it, and the clothes cascaded down like Kekabeka Falls. And I mean, all over the floor, all over the place. She moved out. We went, "We love you, but goodbye." And so here's the point, guys. Whatever you do, your kids are going to repeat it. They're going to imitate it because monkeys see monkey do, and they're monkeys, and you're a monkey, right? And so that's just sort of how it works. I want to tell you a little story, true story, kind of an amazing growing up story that'll illustrate this whole point. When I grew up, when I was in elementary school, I had my 2 best friends, and don't miss the names. My 2 best friends were Bob Lawless and Keith Straight. And Bob Lawless and Keith Straight lived on the same street, 3 houses down from each other. Now, the Lawless family was hilarious. I loved going over to the Lawless house because it was a disaster. The grass was never mowed. The house was falling apart. These people, they left their shoes on. The furniture was all ratty. But the thing I loved the most about the Lawless house was when you got invited over for dinner, you ate dinner in the living room in front of the television. I mean, that was the best. When you're 10, I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. And I will never forget this picture because Mr. Lawless, he sat right in the middle. And he had a big, easy chair right in the middle. And he sat there in that chair right in front of the television. And Mrs. Lawless would bring us our food. And he had this great big stomach. And he put his plate right on top of his stomach like this. It fit a plate perfectly like this. And he sat there like this, and he ate like this, and he never took his eyes off the television. And his white t-shirt, it doubled as a tablecloth and a napkin. And he could just wipe his face like that. And he just sat, and I thought, this place is fantastic. And so, you know, we'd go over there, and we'd all sit in the living room, we'd eat food and spill it all over ourselves. It was fantastic. And see, I mean, imagine this, eating while you were watching television. Because that's not what happened in our house. In our house, the TV went off the moment we sat down at the dinner table. Anybody grew up in that house? Yeah, and that TV was off. Now, here was the problem. My mother had this terrible habit of having Sunday night dinner exactly at 6 o'clock every Sunday night, because my grandmother came over. Who remembers what was on at 6 o'clock on Sunday night? Yeah, The Wonderful World of Disney. And we missed it every single week because we were in the dining room with our silverware and our pinkies in the air. I know darn well the Lawlesses are watching Disney and eating their food off their stomachs. So that's a little snapshot of the Lawless house. 3 doors down, my other best friend lived, you gotta love it, Keith Strait. And Keith Strait, father, was a missionary from Kenya on furlough. I didn't know what a missionary was. I didn't know where Kenya was, but that was an interesting household. I mean, the grass was mowed, the house was neat as a pin. Reverend Strait, he wore dress pants and a white dress shirt 7 days a week. His wife had a long skirt and her hair in a bun. And that was the Strait family. And so I went over there for dinner, only once. And I went over for dinner, and his mother, Keith's mother, made this amazing meal. And I remember it came out, and she put it on the table, and there it was. The aroma was fantastic, and it was steaming off the plate. And then Reverend Strait said this. He said, now we're going to have a season of prayer. Now, I didn't know that he meant by season like spring or fall, and that's how long it was going to go. And he did a 20-minute Bible study on Hezekiah. Who's Hezekiah? I didn't know who that was. I remember today. But who was Hezekiah? And then after the Bible study, he said, now we're going to have another season of silent prayer. I thought, okay, that was spring. This is summer. And the whole time the food's getting cold. I'd never done silent prayer. Actually, I hadn't really done out loud prayer either. And so this is what they did, the whole family. So they only have one son, Keith, and so the 4 of us sat there like this around the table. Well, that's what they were doing. I was doing this. What is wrong with you people? I'm looking between my fingers and thinking, lady, that food is getting cold. We should be eating it. We do grace at home, but it goes something like this. Rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub, yay God. And what are we doing in this season of prayer? I thought it was the most bizarre household I had ever seen in my life. Keith Strait, in spite of the fact that it seemed like he was maybe from Mars, even though he said it was Kenya, let me tell you about him. He was probably the finest person I'd ever known growing up. He was the kindest. He was the most generous. He actually only had 4 toys, and I didn't dare admire them because you know what he would do with it? He would give it to me. My father was a lawyer and I had 400 toys at home. I didn't need another one. This poor kid had 4. They didn't even own a television set. And they had almost nothing. They were these poor missionary family. And I'll tell you, he was just this amazing kid. And after a year of being my friend, they went back to Kenya and never saw him again, never heard from him. I don't know what he's doing today. But you heard the story. I can well imagine that Keith Strait is somewhere in Kenya or somewhere else in the world running an orphanage or preaching or doing something and advancing the kingdom of God. I believe that that's how this kid would have ended up. Do you want to hear how Bob Lawless ended up? My friend Bob Lawless? Well, let me tell you all about it. We stopped being friends in junior high because he started doing drugs. And by senior high, he was selling drugs. And then after high school, I heard the rumor that he had become a pimp and he was selling prostitutes. And you know what he's doing today? He's selling real estate. That's what he's doing. It's a slippery slope, my friends. You never know where this thing's going to go. I'll tell you, that should be a lesson to every one of you. So the first thing is mentorship. The second thing is affirmation. The third thing is role model. And the last and the final thing is sacrifice. Now, how many of you think that maybe, just maybe, the Rechabites were making a few sacrifices along the way to live this lifestyle? They were living in tents I know there's not a single person in here that's lived in a tent. A few of you have gone camping. How many of you have ever gone camping? And you've tried it for a few days, right? Do you know that growing up, our parents never, not once, ever took us camping? Do you know why? Because they loved us. That's why. They're not going to make us go sleep outside with the bears and the bugs and the rain and lie on the ground when we have perfectly good beds at home. Why would we do that? Right? So that's why they didn't do it. And I mean, you've all heard the expression, oh, he's not a happy camper. Where do you think that expression comes from? I'm just trying to point out to you, this was a huge sacrifice that these guys made for the lifestyle that their great whatever grandfather, Jonadab, told them they had to adhere to, and 240 years later, they're still living by it. And the other thing that they were told, so live in tents, and the other thing was to don't drink wine. I mean, this is a crazy story. Who's offering them the wine? The prophet's trying to get them to have a drink. He invited them over for drinks, and they said, no, we're not drinking it, because, Jonadab told us no drinking. Now, here's my question for you. In Scripture, is drinking a sin? The answer would be no to that. You will not find one single Scripture where it actually says that drinking is a sin. There is a sin related to it. What's it called? It's called drunkenness, right? And so, but here's what happened. The Protestant church is kind of, for many years has leaned over to the abstinence side, and we haven't been much of drinkers. And how many of you grew up in a church where they sort of frowned on drinking? Any of you grew up in one of those churches? You know what? The rest of you are in one right now, by the way. You guys are really out of it. and so, so here's what happened is the church sort of frowned on this, the Protestant church anyway. And then what happened was Christians discovered, hey, this isn't really a sin, and we actually have liberty to have a drink. You do have liberty to have a drink. It's true. But here's what happens, and I've seen it again and again. One drink becomes 2 drinks, and 2 drinks becomes 3 drinks, and 3 drinks becomes a drink every day, and then it becomes dependency, and your liberty becomes now bondage. And let me tell you something. Out of the last 3 pastors that I have seen crash and burn, all 3 of them have been due to alcohol abuse. There's something wrong with this picture, people. We have been using our liberty to put us into bondage. And when Kathy and I got married 35 years ago, we just made a decision. We thought, you know what? We don't actually see anything good in this, and so we're just not going to drink. But let me tell you one really awkward situation I had. I was with a group of pastors, fairly new introduction to them. We'd had meetings all day, and at the end of the day, we're sitting in a hotel room. One of them opens up a bottle of wine, and he starts pouring glasses of wine, just like Jeremiah did. And so he gets to me, and he says, Mark, would you like a glass of wine? To which I said, no thanks, I don't drink. I'm a real Christian. Did I mention I was a smart aleck? Have I ever mentioned that? And so anyway, that's what I said. I created the most awkward moment you can possibly imagine. He sat there with the bottle tilted like that, and everybody was in frozen silence. And it was a super awkward moment. And then he says to me, well, do you mind if I have a drink? To which I said, no, do you mind if I smoke a joint? I didn't have a joint. I was poking at him. And here's what I want you to understand. Here's what happened. So we raised our 3 children, who are all in their 20s and their 30s now. We raised them in a house where we never had alcohol. And we never ever told them that they were forbidden to drink, and when they became of age, they could have gone out for a drink if they wanted, but they made the same choice we did. Now they're in their 20s and 30s, and they too have made this decision not to drink and have never had a drink. And see, that's what we can do by our example and by mentoring and making the sacrifices that change the way our kids live in this world, because we are men and women from Mars. Don't miss my grand point here. I'm actually not talking about alcohol. I am talking about our example, and I'm talking about how we live and the things we are trying to transmit to our kids. In my family, the thing was generational alcoholism. In your family, you have other issues. And it might be generational abuse, or generational violence, or generational poverty, or generational materialism for that matter. We all have stuff. We all have baggage. And guess what? Man, you are the ones who can change that. You are the ones who can draw the line in the sand, and you can say, this day, this is changing, because I can live according to the precepts and according to the principles of my God and the kingdom of heaven, and I'm going to raise up my children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, and when they are old, they will not depart, and you can do it, because, man, you are from Mars, and your kids are too. Happy Father's Day.
The one question a person should ask is, what on earth am I doing here? In Pastor Mark's new book, A Greater Purpose, you will fully realize that we are all here for a divine purpose. This book will help you discover your own personal destiny. You can order a copy by visiting our website at churchoftherock.ca. Order a copy today and begin your journey to finding your place in God's great big space.